Lily and Charlie Richards were once the picture-perfect siblings living in a quiet suburban town that seemed to have it all. But behind their innocent smiles and the pristine walls of their home, a horrific secret festered, one that would shatter the illusion of their idyllic life and leave the community reeling with the devastating truth of the darkest crime they had ever witnessed. In a quiet suburban town where the houses were neatly spaced and the trees lined the streets in perfect symmetry, lived the Richards family, the kind of family you might easily overlook. On the surface, they seemed like any other. Richard, the father, was a tall man with a quiet demeanor. He worked long hours as an accountant, often returning home after dark, his briefcase in hand, his face etched with the usual signs of a day spent under fluorescent lights. Emily, the mother, was a picture of domestic perfection, always well put together with a soft smile and a welcoming presence. She stayed at home, tending to the children, keeping the house spotless, and managing every aspect of family life. Together, they had 2 children, Lily, a bright and curious 10-year-old girl, and her younger brother Charlie, just 7 years old. They were the perfect pair. Lily, the nurturing big sister, always looking out for Charlie, and Charlie, the energetic, playful boy who could make friends with anyone. The family seemed content, the epitome of suburban bliss. Their house, a charming 2-story with a white picket fence, was always the same on the outside. Neighbors waved when they saw them, and people often remarked that the Richards family had it all: success, good looks, and happiness. From the outside, it was hard to imagine anything was amiss. They had the kind of life people envied: family, barbecues, smiling faces, and the typical holiday photos posted online for everyone to see. But behind that image, something darker was brewing, hidden behind closed doors and well-manicured walls. It started slowly, small shifts that no one really noticed. Emily, once the glowing picture of a perfect mum, began to withdraw. She seemed more tired, more distant, as if the weight of her perfect life was starting to bear down on her. Richard's long hours at work became even longer, and when he was home, he was often silent, lost in his own thoughts. The children, once lively and full of energy, began to change. Lily, the little girl who had once loved to play with her friends in the yard, started avoiding the other kids at school. She no longer smiled as brightly, and her teachers noticed that her work, once impeccable, began to suffer. She seemed tired, exhausted even. Charlie, too, became more subdued. He had always been a bundle of energy, the kind of child who couldn't sit still for a second. But now his enthusiasm seemed to fade. His once playful antics were replaced with a quiet reluctance to participate. He would no longer run to the door to greet his father when he came home. Instead, he would often retreat into the corner, his face expressionless. But none of this raised any alarms. To the outside world, the Richards family still appeared to have it all. They attended neighborhood parties, they smiled for pictures, and they kept up appearances. No one asked questions. No one dared to wonder what was happening behind the closed doors of their home. The bruises on Charlie's arms, the quiet tears in Lily's eyes, they all went unnoticed, masked by the illusion of perfection. Yet, if anyone had paid close attention, they might have seen the warning signs. Lily's constant tiredness, Charlie's withdrawn nature, the way Emily seemed to avoid eye contact with people. But in a town where everyone believed they knew everyone else's story, no one bothered to look closer. No one questioned the family who had always been so perfect. No one could have imagined the darkness that was slowly consuming them from the inside out. As the days turned into months, the Richards family's decline became more subtle, yet undeniable. On the surface, they continued to live their lives, with a semblance of normalcy, but cracks began to show. Small, imperceptible changes that, if pieced together, painted a haunting picture. Neighbors who had once exchanged friendly greetings with Emily and Richard now found themselves walking past their house without a second glance. There was no longer any warm wave from Emily at the mailbox or a cheerful chat over the fence. Richard, who used to stand at the edge of the yard, greeting neighbors with his signature grin, now kept his distance, often coming home late or disappearing into the house without a word. The silence between the family members was deafening, and in a neighborhood where everyone prided themselves on being close-knit, it was impossible to ignore the growing sense of unease. Lily's teachers began to notice changes too. Once an eager student who loved to read and learn, she became distracted in class, often gazing out of the window or scribbling absent-mindedly in the margins of her notebooks. Her handwriting, once neat and meticulous, had grown sloppier. She stopped asking questions in class, and when called on, her responses were quieter, almost as if she were too tired to think. Her homework, once a reflection of her diligent work ethic, began piling up. She would forget assignments, or worse, turn in work that seemed half-finished. Teachers initially chalked it up to typical pre-adolescent behavior, but there was something in Lily's eyes that made them uneasy, something that hinted at a deeper issue. Still, no one had the courage to ask. After all, Lily's parents were well known in the community. Emily was the perfect mom, always involved in school activities and volunteering for every event. Richard was a steady figure, always cordial, during parent-teacher conferences. How could anyone suspect that the children were being neglected, let alone abused? Charlie, too, was changing. The once boisterous, playful boy had become more withdrawn. The lively energy he once had seemed drained from him, as if his spirit had been quietly extinguished. He no longer ran around with his friends after school or asked to play video games. Instead, he stayed inside, hunched over books or quietly watching TV. His skin had become pale, and his eyes, once wide with wonder, now appeared heavy, distant. His teachers found it strange when he would often show up with unexplained bruises on his arms or legs. They weren't severe, but enough to raise an eyebrow. When asked about them, Charlie would mumble something about falling or tripping, but it always seemed a little too rehearsed. The subtlety of his injuries only raised more questions, but without clear proof, no one dared to pry too much. The neighborhood children had begun to notice the Richard siblings' absence from playdates and school events. Lily had once been a fixture at birthday parties, always ready to help decorate or play games. Charlie had been the first to volunteer for schoolyard games, his laugh ringing through the air as he ran from one side of the playground to the other. But now, the Richards children had become ghosts in the eyes of their peers. They were rarely seen outside. When they were, they often stood by the window, their faces pressed against the glass, watching the other children play from afar. The slow, painful withdrawal of Lily and Charlie into the shadows of their own home went unnoticed, hidden beneath layers of suburban complacency. As the outside world carried on, busy with its own worries, no one seemed to ask what was really happening behind those walls. Even though the signs were there, the bruises, the silence, the isolation, everyone simply assumed that the Richards family was going through a rough patch. It was a natural thing, they thought. They didn't know that what had been happening inside that house was far worse than anything anyone could imagine. And so, the Richards family continued to live in quiet misery, each passing day adding another layer of suffering. It was a crisp autumn evening when everything finally unraveled. The events of that night would forever change the quiet town and expose the true horrors hidden behind the Richards family's picture-perfect facade. It began like any other evening in the quiet neighborhood. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawns. Emily was preparing dinner in the kitchen. Richard was settling into his favorite chair in the living room, and Lily and Charlie were in their rooms, supposedly doing their homework. But the peace was shattered by a sudden, deafening crash, a noise so loud and jarring that it seemed to rattle the very walls of the house. It came from upstairs, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Neighbors who were outside walking their dogs or chatting by their mailboxes heard the commotion too. Some paused, wondering if it was a child knocking something over, or perhaps an accident in the house. But the sound that followed was far more unsettling, a scream. A blood-curdling, frantic cry that cut through the evening air. In a town where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened, this was enough to raise alarm. Several neighbors rushed to their windows, straining to see what was happening. No one dared approach the house. The Richards family, after all, had always been so private, so careful to maintain their perfect image. But that scream was unmistakable, a desperate, hopeless cry that no one could ignore. Inside the house it was chaos. Charlie, in a fit of terror, had bolted from his room, trying to flee the house. His small body slammed into the glass door leading to the backyard in his frantic attempt to escape. His head struck the door with a sickening thud. Blood quickly began to pool around him, but Charlie was unconscious, his fragile form crumpled against the glass. In his mind, he had been trying to run from something far worse than any physical injury. He had been trying to outrun the nightmare that had been his life for the past several years. Lily, in an act of sheer desperation, had thrown herself in front of her brother, attempting to shield him from their father's violent rage. She had been the one to try to protect him all along. Her body was found collapsed on the cold kitchen floor, a tragic symbol of a child's last effort to save the one she loved most. Her injuries were horrific. Bruises, cuts, and burns covered her small frame. The coroner would later describe it as an act of pure selflessness, but it was also the final tragic act of a child who had fought too long and too hard to survive. When the police arrived, the house was eerily silent. The neighbors, too frightened to approach, could only watch as officers swarmed the property. Inside, they found Charlie barely breathing, his body covered in the marks of abuse. The paramedics rushed him to the hospital where doctors would later say he was lucky to be alive. But it was too late for Lily. She had died from her injuries before anyone could help. The police immediately launched an investigation, but the scene they discovered was far more chilling than they could have ever expected. The Richards house, once a place of warmth and comfort, now stood as a grim monument to years of suffering and torment. The walls were lined with evidence of a life lived in fear. Furniture overturned, broken objects scattered on the floor, and the unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. But it wasn't just the physical destruction that was horrifying. It was the realization that no one had ever suspected what was happening behind those walls. The neighbors, the teachers, the family friends, they had all failed to see the truth as the investigation continued. The shocking details began to emerge. The children had been subjected to years of constant abuse, physical, emotional, and psychological. They had been isolated from the world, their every move controlled, their every action scrutinized by their parents. The perfect family facade had concealed a nightmare of cruelty and neglect. The community was left in stunned disbelief. How could this have happened right under their noses? How could no one have seen the signs? The truth was difficult to swallow, but it was undeniable. The Richards family had not been the picture of suburban bliss. They had been hiding a deadly secret, one that would change everything. And the tragic fate of Lily, a child who had given her life trying to protect her brother, would become the catalyst for a larger, more painful reckoning with the darkness that had taken root in the heart of the community. As the investigation into the Richards family's horrifying secret deepened, the community's sense of disbelief turned to anger and confusion. Neighbors who had once considered the Richards family exemplary members of their tight-knit neighborhood now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. How had this gone on for so long? Why had no one noticed the signs of abuse? It was a painful realization. The family, who had seemingly been part of the fabric of their community, had kept their darkest secrets hidden for years, and no one had thought to look beyond the polished exterior they so carefully crafted. The police found a series of shocking clues inside the Richards home, each one more chilling than the last. It wasn't just the physical evidence of abuse that they uncovered, bruises, burns, and cuts covering the children's bodies, but the emotional scars left behind, trapped in pages of a hidden diary belonging to Lily. The diary was a heartbreaking window into her tortured existence. Each page revealed more of the horrifying truth about her life with her parents and the torment she and Charlie had suffered. Lily's writing was filled with words of desperation, her handwriting shaky and filled with sorrow. She wrote about the fear she felt every day, how her parents had become monsters in their own home. The diary told the story of how she had tried to protect her brother from their parents' cruelty, how she had hidden the bruises and scratches from the world, and how she had carried the weight of the abuse on her small shoulders. There were entries detailing how Richard and Emily would often fight, screaming at each other while the children were forced to watch. But even worse were the descriptions of the physical abuse they endured. Lily wrote about how Richard would strike them with objects, how Emily would scream at them for the smallest of mistakes, and how they were both punished for things they couldn't control. What stood out most, however, was the pattern of isolation. Lily spoke of how they were kept away from other children, forbidden from making friends, and how their social lives had been stifled. The more the police uncovered, the more they realized that the abuse had been calculated, a slow and steady process of breaking the children's spirits. There had been no one to turn to. No extended family had ever visited, and when friends tried to invite the children over for playdates, Emily would always find a reason to decline. She kept them locked away in their rooms, out of sight, out of mind. In addition to the diary, the police found a collection of photographs, some of which had been taken years before the incident. They were images of the children, smiling and clean, but with a sense of sadness in their eyes, an unsettling premonition that no one had recognized. The photos were displayed as if they were symbols of a life that didn't match the dark reality behind closed doors. These pictures, while seemingly innocent at first glance, now carried a heavy weight, as though they were an attempt by the parents to keep up the illusion of a happy family. Richard and Emily were arrested shortly after the discovery of the diary. Their reactions were cold, detached. Emily, who had once appeared so gentle and loving, was a shell of a person when she was taken into custody. Richard, too, showed no remorse. It was as if they had both disconnected from reality long ago, unable or unwilling to comprehend the depth of their actions. Their defense was as chilling as their crime, an attempt to justify their behavior, to explain away the abuse as discipline, or worse, a necessity. But the evidence told a different story, one of years of cruelty, control, and manipulation. The trial that followed was a media spectacle. Reporters flocked to the courtroom, cameras flashing, trying to capture the details of the case that had shaken the town to its core. People who had once considered the Richards family friends now struggled to reconcile their memories of the family with the horrific truth that had come to light. The children's suffering had been hidden for so long, wrapped in the illusion of a perfect family. Now, as the details of their torment came to light, it was impossible for anyone to deny what had happened. The court was filled with testimonies from those who had known the Richards family, from teachers who remembered Lily's increasing withdrawal, to neighbors who noticed the children's isolation. But none of them had questioned it. None of them had thought to look closer. And so the trial continued, with the haunting realization that the Richards family's tragic story was far from over. While Lily's life was lost, Charlie survived, though the trauma he had experienced would stay with him forever. He became the forgotten victim in a story that no one had seen coming. His future was uncertain, and his road to recovery would be long and painful. But the community had learned a valuable lesson. Appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes the worst horrors are hidden in plain sight. The aftermath of the trial left the town reeling, shaken by the profound cruelty that had been hidden under the Richards family's seemingly perfect life. As Richard and Emily sat in their cells, facing life sentences, the community struggled to process what had unfolded. For so long, the Richards family had been a staple in the neighborhood, always polite, always smiling. The horrific truth behind the closed doors of their home shattered the illusion of suburban safety, leaving a lingering sense of unease that would never quite fade. Charlie, the sole survivor, was left to navigate the wreckage of his childhood. He had witnessed the brutal death of his sister, the last act of love she had shown as she tried to protect him from their parents' violent rage. The trauma he had endured was incomprehensible, and while doctors and therapists worked tirelessly to help him heal, the scars, both physical and emotional, would never truly disappear. For months, he was withdrawn and reluctant to speak. He clung to what little was left of the family he once knew, but the pain was undeniable, and the grief was overwhelming. Though Charlie was in the care of extended family members now, his new life was far from simple. He would have to learn to navigate a world that had, until recently, been a foreign concept to him. He was no longer the carefree boy who had played on the swings or laughed with friends. His world had been so tightly controlled, so carefully crafted by his parents' manipulation, that he had no idea how to function outside of the walls that once confined him. For months, he fought to trust anyone. The smallest sounds would make him jump, and he had a deep fear of being alone. It would take years for him to even begin to understand that the love and safety he needed was still out there, waiting for him. But for now, the scars were too deep, and his mind too fragile. The town, too, was left grappling with what had happened. People who had once been friends, neighbors, and co-workers with Richard and Emily Richards now found themselves questioning their own judgment How could they have been so blind? It wasn't just the abuse they had ignored. It was the subtle warning signs that no one had been brave enough to confront. Neighbors had turned their backs when they noticed the children playing alone for days on end. Teachers had turned a blind eye to Lily's declining academic performance, not realizing that it was a cry for help. No one had asked the right questions, and in their silence, they had failed. The media, too, moved on, as it always does. Headlines shifted away from the trial, replaced by new stories of tragedy and triumph. The case of the Richards family, once the subject of public outrage and heartbreak, became another forgotten chapter in the world of true crime. But for Charlie, the memories of his sister and the years of abuse would never fade. He would grow up with a heavy heart, carrying with him the weight of what had been stolen from him and Lily, his childhood, his innocence, his sense of safety. As the years passed, the town moved forward. New families moved into the homes where
the Richards once lived. The house, once a symbol of a perfect family, now stood as an empty shell, haunted by the ghosts of a past no one cared to remember.
the streets returned to their quiet routine, and people went on with their lives, all the while ignoring the fact that just under the surface, the deepest tragedies often remain buried. But Charlie never forgot. He never forgot his sister, the girl who had given her life to protect him. He never forgot the life they should have had, the future that was stolen from them both. And although the world may have moved on, Charlie knew that he would never truly escape the memories. It was the worst case of child abuse and murder that few had heard about, but for him, it would be the story that defined his life.